Journal entry, October 27th, 2024. One of the great pleasures of keeping an anonymous journal like this is that I can ramble on as I please, with no need to structure my thoughts in any logical or accessible way. For so long, everything I've ever done within the realms of the occult has been with someone else in mind. Mentoring, teaching, guiding. The students and mentees of the society always came first. But this journal, this is purely for me. A bit of indulgence, if I'm being honest. That said, old habits die hard, and when I get onto a topic like the devil, Old Scratch, the folk devil, him at the crossroads, I can't help but feel the need to make some sense of it all, even if it's just legible for an outside ear. I sometimes grumble about teaching, but there really is something to be said for it. It's one of the few things that forces you to stop, reflect, and really think about what you're doing. I can do all these things, cast, craft, conjure, but actually explaining how and why I do them is a different matter. Teaching someone else to understand it in words makes you better at the craft itself. It forces you to refine the edges of your practice to articulate things that are often more intuitive than intellectual. And of course, I do love my anecdotes and metaphors. I've always enjoyed mixing the mundane with the magical. How often have I answered a student's metaphysical question by asking them something entirely practical? I've used everything from lifting weights in a gym to the complexities of coding in computer science to illustrate magic. And naturally, I'm fond of referencing the archetypes of the criminal mind. See my work on Four Thieves Vinegar. The old me would have cut to the point by now. But here in this journal, I can afford to wander. It's refreshing to let the thoughts spill out without needing to package them neatly for someone else's benefit. So, where was I? Ah, yes. Today I was reminded not so much of the devil himself, but of one of his, let's call them groupies. There's something amusing about those who dabble in the darker corners of the occult, thinking they're courting the devil himself, when really they're just playing dress-up with the shadows. They don't realize they're dancing on the edge of something far more complex, far more ancient than their imaginations can handle. Many years ago, a man tracked me down in a bit of a state. He was frantic, distraught. Though English wasn't his first language, that much was clear. But somehow, for reasons I still don't fully understand, he ended up knocking on my metaphorical door, looking for help. Urgent help at that. I agreed to arrange a video call with him, although I always approach these situations with a healthy dose of skepticism. You meet all kinds of so-called magical folk online, and let's just say, not all of them are serious practitioners. Still, his persistence piqued my curiosity, especially when he started talking about how a witch had cursed his relationship with the devil. Well, I thought, why not hear him out? Even if it turned out to be nonsense, it might be good for a laugh. What can I say? Sometimes it's entertaining to see where these stories go. The man in question, who I'll call the Fool, for reasons that will become clear, was, as you might guess, a bit of a fool in many ways. But that's not just me being harsh. He earned that code name for a reason, and I've given out a few tarot code names over the years, but that's another story for another day. Anyway, our fool had gotten involved with a German witch. Not just some goth chick with a penchant for black candles and dark lipstick, but someone with actual roots in the craft. She came from a line of old crafters. Serious stuff. Now, Fool here, well, he fit the stereotype of an armchair magician in every way. Fascinated by the occult, reading endless books but not really understanding what he was playing with. His obsession got him tangled up with this witch, and let's just say he ended up being used for ritual purposes, and I suspect for financial purposes too. At some point, our fool agreed to be put up as collateral for a certain entity during a ritual. He claimed the entity was the devil, but let's be real, that's a can of worms I'm not opening fully today. What matters is that, during this ritual, Fool witnessed his first full physical manifestation of a spirit. And that, well, that left a mark. I suspect, and I know now, that this experience, this being his first real encounter with the spirit world, was why he became obsessed. First-time experiences have a way of sticking with you, don't they? Especially when it comes to things like this. Virgins never forget their first, after all. After the ritual, once Fool had outlived his usefulness, the witch broke things off with him. He seemed to accept the breakup without much fuss. He could walk away from the witch. But the devil, or whoever the entity was, now that was something he couldn't let go of. For years after, he remained haunted by this being, continuing to try and make deals, feeding it offerings on auspicious dates, and pouring a ridiculous amount of attention and energy into the relationship. And as we all know, where attention goes, energy flows. But here's the kicker. He never really got anything in return. That's the part that fascinated me. He was stuck in this loop, giving and giving, getting nothing back, but still desperately clinging to the idea that this entity was his ticket to power. I knew if he was ever going to break free of this, he'd have to grow some balls and face the situation head on. I told him as much, blunt as I can be, and of course he didn't take it well. No one likes being told the obvious truth, that they're stuck because they're too afraid to change. But I warned him, if he didn't act, things would get worse. And yet somehow they'd also stay the same. No real power, no growth, just an endless loop of servitude. I could see where this was going. It was a battle he wasn't prepared to fight. He was stuck, feeding something that would never truly serve him in return, trapped in a cycle of giving without receiving. It was almost 2 years after our initial meeting when the fool tracked me down again. He opened the conversation with, "It has gotten worse, just like you said." I won't lie, I smirked a bit at that. It's a pattern I've seen countless times. People come to me for advice, ignore it, and then circle back when things inevitably spiral out of control. Honestly, it's like watching someone board up a leaking pipe instead of just fixing the leak, only for the whole thing to burst later on. Common sense would have saved them the hassle, but some people just can't be told. So the fool was back, and this time things had really gone sideways. Despite all his efforts, endless petitions to the devil for money and power, he found himself getting screwed over by a supposed business partner, and, of all things, stuck in a ridiculous love triangle with a woman and her mother. Now, I've always known the fool to be a bit of a cuck, easily manipulated by women with a certain disposition, but this? To be the personal slave to both the maiden and the crone simultaneously? It was comical, to say the least. You see, our fool had a full-time job, but because he worked from home, his younger girlfriend, who liked going out quite often, had roped him into doing her job as well. As I recall, she worked for some kind of call centre or customer liaison role, so Fool was left answering her phone all day, on top of doing his own work, while she gallivanted around town. And as if that wasn't bad enough, her mother had somehow weaseled her way into his life too, making demands. It was a mess. He was running the household, paying the bills, doing 2 jobs, and all the while still under the delusion that his deal with the devil was going to pay off eventually. Now, let me be clear. Calling these women sirens is probably an insult to the sirens of mythology. These 2 were no enchantresses. They were just using him. And Fool, for all his talk of power and magic, had let himself become their personal servant. I told him again that he needed to stop being such a pushover. I even gave him an actual ritual to perform, something that would help him work on his boundaries and develop a bit of spine. And I set him some homework too. He needed to start learning energy manipulation, basic stuff, before he could even think about tackling anything like the devil. I mean, it's all well and good to petition spirits for help, but if you can't manifest even the simplest thing on your own, you're setting yourself up for failure. It wasn't just his magical aptitude that was the issue, though. I've taught plenty of people who couldn't magic their way out of a wet paper bag, as they say. The real problem with the fool was psychological. Deep down he was a slave, a servant, a masochist. And that mindset? That doesn't bode well for magic. Magic requires power, self-possession, and the will to control your reality. If at your core you're wired to be subservient, it's an uphill battle. Things eventually got better for him, but it was a struggle. He had to learn to stand on his own 2 feet and stop relying on spirits to do everything for him. That's something a lot of beginners in magic don't understand. You can't just call on the spirits and expect them to do all the heavy lifting. You need to put in the work. And for the fool, that meant breaking his old patterns of submission and learning to wield real power, his own power. I've had plenty of experiences with that same entity, But I'll save those stories for another time. There are things people should really know about Old Scratch, and funny enough, I don't see these YouTube witches discussing it. Maybe that's for the best, though. Some knowledge needs to be earned, not handed out like candy. But I digress. That's a tale for another day.